someone else wants to do that, you're more than welcome. But I figured it's just as easy for me to do that since I'm sharing them on my screen. So we'll begin with the praise to Shakyamuni Buddha. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. To the founder, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the one gone beyond, the foe destroyer, the completely perfected, fully awakened being, perfect in knowledge and in good conduct, Sugata, knower of the world, supreme guide of human beings to be tamed, teacher of gods and human beings, to you, the completely and fully awakened one, the endowed transcendent destroyer, the glorious conqueror, the subduer from the Shakya clan, I prostrate, make offerings, and go for refuge. We'll do the short mandala offering. Let's just do this in English tonight. My voice is a little off because of allergies, I think. I think that's what's going on. So, but anyway, let's recite this with the visualization of offering the entire purified universe as a kind of a Buddha field for all beings to be able to cultivate that final result. And we're making that vast offering so we can receive the blessings to accomplish these teachings quickly. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. I will try chanting the refuge prayer, but let's do this once in English and then we'll try twice in the Tibetan. Hopefully my voice will be okay for that. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chenyen gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki Chanyen Gipe Sonam Gi Dola Panchir Sangye Dupar Shog. All right, let's do a short meditation. As usual, we're just going to spend the first few minutes focusing on the breath, just trying to calm the mind by using the breath in whatever technique you prefer. And whenever the mind wanders from the breath, just guide the mind back to the breath. And that's all we'll be doing for the next few minutes in silence. Then I'll come in and I'll lead you in a short reflection to set our motivation for our time together tonight. So we can begin the breathing meditation now. So now let's set our motivation of bodhicitta for our time together tonight. As we've been seeing in this text, there are many practices that we are being encouraged to engage in, ways of going about living our lives, how we interact with each other, and so on. But all of these are being advised in the context of bodhicitta. And when we practice morality or generosity or any other activity that is virtuous, we have different results that will accrue from that depending upon our motivation. What we're looking at here in this text is the Bodhisattva's way of using these practices, which is always together with bodhicitta, always with the most far-reaching goal, helping all sentient beings without exception to attain their greatest potential. And then within that, the recognition that to accomplish that for other beings, we have to become enlightened ourselves. We have to achieve our own potential, and then we can work perfectly for others. So as we set about another evening of looking at this uh, garland of advice that Master Atisha is giving us, we can do so with that motivation, wishing to help all beings to achieve Buddhahood, and of course, our own attainment of enlightenment as the means of accomplishing that. And you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So again, welcome everyone. Thank you for allowing me to do this from Santa Fe here. There was no way I could have made it up to Taos with everything I had to do today to get ready to leave. So, and it'll make it much easier for me to get down to Albuquerque for the flight out tomorrow. So thank you for allowing me to teach online tonight. Remember, tomorrow or next week I will be teaching online as well from Land of Medicine Buddha in near Santa Cruz, and then we won't have class the following week when I'm on retreat. But then I'll be back in the Gompa, you know, karma willing, and I'll be there on March 20th to do a teaching in person again. So we are working again with this text, the Lama Atisha's Bodhisattva's Jewel Garland. Once more, this idea that each of these are kind of individual little things that we adorn ourselves with, that we use to beautify our being in the world and our way of working with others and cultivating all the proper minds and practices and what have you. So I don't need to say too much more as an introduction beyond that. Let's just go ahead and get back into the text. We haven't made it so far yet, but I'm kind of hopeful that tonight we'll catch up in regard to some of these verses. We are up to verse 7, and we see that we have this line that kind of harkens us back to one of the earlier verses where we were talking about giving up material wealth, not being so obsessed with that. And of course, the 8 worldly dharmas that are a pair of them are around wealth, and a pair of them are around comfort, and then the other pair around praise, and then the last pair around having a good reputation. But anyway, this idea of giving up material possessions, forsaking our, again, it doesn't mean we give them up completely, but we aren't obsessed with them. We don't have an attachment to them. It says there, forsake those and embellish yourself with what we call the wealth of the noble ones. And the way Alex Burson translates that, I just put that on the screen because I thought it was kind of useful to see some other words behind this. Let me rid myself of all material burdens. I like that concept. That these are not just material possessions, they are actually material burdens often. And then adorn myself with what's called an Arya's gems. Now, again, this idea of material burdens, when you do have a lot, we even saw this in one of the earlier verses. If we aren't content with what we have, then we're constantly looking to acquire more. And then, of course, being neurotic about what we already have and making sure people don't steal it, take it from us, what have you. But people can get obsessed with material possessions and in that kind of acquisition mode and really trying to obtain as many things as possible. But this is all going to have to be left behind when we get to our deathbed. You can't take a single item with you, no matter how precious those objects were to you in this life. Again, they're all left behind. So as I said here, we should instead kind of be preoccupied more with adorning ourselves with what are called here the Arya's gems or the wealth of the noble ones. Again, this is where we're going to actually jump forward to these gems that are mentioned in later verses. I mentioned this towards the beginning of the class that we're going to alter the order just a little bit from what Thupten Jinpa has. So, in commenting on this, Geshe Ngawang Dargye says, thus we should abandon attachment for external ornaments while retaining within us the gems of a superior person. That superior person, or Arya, as was mentioned there, the noble ones, that's referring to those beings who have attained direct insight into emptiness. They are further along the path than most of us, if not all of us, and therefore they're very worthy objects of admiring and trying to see what they do with their lives, what have you. So there are 7 of these inner gems to adorn our mind rather than those outer things that we can become obsessed with. These are named and explained at the conclusion of this text, and it's specifically in verse 25 and then the first 3 lines of verse 26, which I've placed just after this verse, according to James B. Apple's translation. I mentioned that translation earlier on. It's in the book on Lama Atisha that is a biography of him. So let's take a look at these. I'm just not going to talk about them a whole lot because we saw these 7, you might recall, when we looked at Nagarjuna's text about a year ago. In his letter to a friend, he speaks about these 7 gems or 7 jewels. And here they're in Thupten Jinpa's text, he calls them these wealths: the wealth of faith, the wealth of ethics, of giving, of learning, of conscience, of remorse, and then of insight. These are the 7 riches or the 7 wealths. So each of these I think we know very well because we've seen them before in our teachings and what have you. Faith is, of course, an amazing quality that we all need to have to some regard. Remember how faith is taught in the context of the 3 jewels in particular, that we need to have a faith in the 3 jewels to protect us from all suffering, whatever level of suffering we're working with, the future suffering and unfortunate rebirths, or continuing to suffer in samsara, or the suffering of all beings and an unenlightened state that we want to have some sort of fear or dread about. All of these can be resolved by having faith in the 3 jewels, particularly in the Dharma. So again, these are being called gems, but I've got a little quote that I'm going to share in shortly, where Alex even refers to them as kind of treasuries, not just individual gems, but actually treasuries that we build up. And our faith can be like that. Faith isn't like one thing that we have at one moment and it stays the same. Our faith hopefully increases over time. It becomes richer and richer and thereby supports us on our spiritual path more and more. So this is the idea behind all of these, is that they grow and develop over time. The second one, I won't keep putting them back on the screen, but that was ethics, the wealth of ethics. I don't need to talk as much about ethics, perhaps, because we did touch on, I believe we had the verse that pertained to avoiding the 10 non-virtues last time. I think we talked about that. But anyway, we've talked about the 10 non-virtues many times, and the opposite of them, to refrain from those actions, is the 10 virtues. And that's our ethical behavior in essence, though obviously it also entails other ways of behaving ethically and of course, following our vows. Those of us who have taken vows, whether we talk about the first level of basic vows, the foundational vows, the pratimoksha, or whether we talk about bodhisattva vows, or whether we talk about tantric vows, those are also part of our ethical discipline that we want to maintain. So here too, our activities in the vein of ethical behavior accumulate over time to where we become more and more ethical and have less and eventually no, engagement in non-virtue. So that's the idea behind that. That is how we want to adorn ourselves, by having that good ethical foundation. Then we have the wealth of giving. The wealth of giving is referring, of course, to all the generosity we can engage in. In traditional Lamrim texts, they talk about 3 levels of generosity. The very first one is the basic generosity of material things that we often think of when we talk about giving, to be able to be free with our resources. And of course, the Bodhisattva, once more, is doing all these practices with bodhicitta motivation, with wanting to benefit others through acts of kindness, sharing what we have. So material wealth is a good thing to be generous with. But secondly, we can also be generous with protecting others from harm. If there's a situation where we have the ability to help a being to not be in a state of suffering, or lose its life, whatever, then we can intervene and provide that level of protection. The third one is perhaps the most important, the giving of the Dharma. And you might think, well, what, I can't give Dharma. I'm not a Dharma teacher. Well, you are a Dharma teacher in essence. You teach even just by teaching through example, through how you are in the world. That's a way of giving to others, so that when we are with others, we have some kind of positive influence on their minds through our abiding in the Dharma. But of course, if we can give instruction on particular teachings, things that we think will be useful to others, that's certainly advised to do, provided that we feel that we are in a position to offer that to them and that they are open to receiving that and that we have the ability to communicate that. But essentially, this is what we are all aiming for. In the eventual state of Buddhahood, that's what a Buddha does primarily, is give the Dharma to others. So it's good to be having that mind of giving in regard to all three of those if we can: material things, protection, as well as giving Dharma. The next one is the jewel of learning, or the wealth of learning. And this means kind of listening to the teachings, studying. We have to accumulate our knowledge of the Dharma. We don't want to become obsessed with just accumulating knowledge and not accumulating meditation and practice as well. But nonetheless, that is how we get the teachings into our minds, is by actually studying the Dharma, reading the texts, attending teachings like what we're doing tonight, and so on. And the more that we study them, do reflect on them, meditate on them, we generate a wealth of listening, of learning that we can then rely upon. When we comes to gaining realizations on the path, we need to have that initial learning. Remember that there are three types of wisdom. We have the wisdom that arises from study, from listening, from acquiring things initially, just hearing the words. We already have some level of wisdom. Secondly, we have the wisdom of reflecting, where we think about the teachings, contemplate them. And you're even doing that perhaps to some degree as we go through these teachings. Thirdly, we have to meditate on them. Meditating on them does refer in a loose way to the meditation that we do currently. But in terms of developing the actual wisdom that arises from meditation, that third level, it does require a great stability of mind. Of course, we'll talk about developing meditative stabilization at times in the text and some of the skills that are needed for that. But the idea here is that that's how all of the accumulation of our wisdom starts, is by listening to the teachings, bringing them into our mind stream. Then we have these other two. Let me go back to the text in this. I think they're called conscience and remorse in the text that we have, the translation from Thupten Jinpa. So conscience and remorse, there are different terms for these in the study of minds and mental factors. This is what I was going through in kind of a loose way, keeping it very practical with Thupten Norbuling here in Santa Fe on Wednesdays the last 3 months. We just had our last class last night. But this is two factors that are said to be virtuous, and one of them is sometimes called self-respect. There it's called conscience in Thupten Jinpa's text. But the idea is that this is where we refrain from misbehavior or having even mind states that are not virtuous and helpful because we want to live up to our own ideals. So here it's like in reference to ourselves. So conscience, I guess, works to some degree. I always think of Jiminy Cricket whenever I hear the word conscience. He's saying always let your conscience be your guide. But it's like the idea is that we have a way that we want to be in the world, particularly as Buddhists. We don't want to engage in particular behaviors, actions, what have you. So we uphold our behavior on the basis of that because we are trying to adhere to that way of ideally seeing ourselves. The other way that we could be kept from engaging in non-virtue is the other one of these, the fifth of these wealths or gems, I'm sorry, the sixth, which is called in our text remorse. I see it more often referred to as consideration for others. And the idea here is that when we are engaging in behavior that is going to reflect badly on other beings, then we should be thinking about the effect it might have on them. I advise, for example, that if you are going about your daily life and you're thinking about doing something, before you do it, if you have any question, if you don't think it's potentially virtuous, well, think about how would my guru, my Lama, What would they think if they saw me right now behaving in this way, thinking in this way, talking, physically acting in this way? And that way we gain an appreciation for what others might, how they might be affected by what we do, how it reflects upon them. And of course, why we also want to be conscious of other people who may witness our behavior who aren't our lamas necessarily, but who might then have a negative impression of Buddhism or the Buddhist teachings, what have you. I point out to people that when I first became a resident teacher here in Santa Fe, and I realized that Santa Fe is a little bigger certainly than Taos, if you include the whole county of Taos and county of Santa Fe. But nonetheless, it's still a relatively small place. You see people around town a lot. So essentially, I was starting to think, well, I'm going to have to be much more careful how I am when I'm out doing my grocery shopping or whatever, just driving around town. How you do think about how if there was somebody who saw me behaving in a particular way, or even I was behaving towards them in that particular way, like somebody who got into the parking spot at Whole Foods before me or something, and I got really upset at them and yelled at them for taking my spot or something like that. If I were to engage in that type of behavior, well, there's a likelihood, maybe not a great likelihood, but they could come into the center here in Santa Fe and walk in and see me as the teacher and go, ah, there's that guy that yelled at me at the Whole Foods parking lot. I mean, they might have a really unfavorable impression then of Buddhism. Like if this is the Buddhist teacher that they have here, well, then why would I want to study that? So I don't know, it's an example, but I think we have to have that awareness of how what we do reflects on others, the effect it can have on them. I mean, it doesn't mean just those who are harmed by our actions, but those who may witness our actions or even imaginary witnesses, again, our teachers or what have you, we might think about at that time. What would they think if they saw us behaving this way right now? So these two forces in the traditional texts are called like shame and embarrassment, and I don't like those terms at all, but self-respect and consideration for others. We uphold our behavior because we care about ourselves and how we ideally want to be in the world, but we also want to think of others and the effects on them. So those two are very powerful ways of curtailing any of our negative behavior. The final one is insight, this sort of wealth of insight. Now, what do we mean by insight? We're talking about some pretty highly developed states of wisdom that we talked earlier about learning being an important part of our accumulation of wealth and things that adorn us. But here we also want to develop deeper insight into all the teachings that the Buddha gave. And that can include certainly the teachings that direct us to what is ultimate truth, what is the final truth that the Buddha taught, which of course has to be realized if we ever are to become an Arya, a noble one, which these are said to be the wealths or the gems of the noble beings, the superior beings. But we also can talk about even just having insight into the conventional phenomena that exist. The Buddha taught that there are both ultimate truths and conventional truths. Of course, conventional truths is everything in the Lam Rim, as well as everything else that exists, that is not emptiness, that is not that most profound truth that we do need to, again, realize eventually in order to overcome all of our own obscurations, to become enlightened ourselves, and so on. So essentially, by insight, a wealth of insight, we mean accumulating more and more knowledge and deeper wisdom of everything the Buddha taught in terms of karma and rebirth and the nature of existence as dukkha and all of these other things that are in the Lam Rim, as well as the deeper insight into emptiness. So know that these are kind of, again, uh, seven factors that increase over time and become particularly powerful when we have become Arya beings. The next slide there will give us a little more on this concept in verse 26 ABC. These precious and excellent jewels or treasuries are the seven inexhaustible riches. Do not speak of these to those not human. Again, by not human, we just mean, certainly any beings who, wouldn't appreciate these teachings, who are perhaps not in a place where they can really hear them and practice them. But certainly we want to speak of these to those beings who will admire these qualities, who will actually take them to heart and practice them. But this concept of like them being the seven inexhaustible riches, this is what I was talking about earlier that Alex talks about, that they become kind of like a treasury, a store of wealth. So he says when we talk about a gem, which is the term he used on these seven, we shouldn't just think of a jewel. Rather, we should think of a treasure that we build up more and more. They're never going to run out, and nor can they be stolen. And that's the one thing, once more, going back to the initial verse where it said, don't be so preoccupied with the wealth of, outside of ourselves, external wealth that we can lose and can be stolen from us and what have you. Put your attention on the inner wealth. Well, if we attend to the inner wealth, no one can take that from you, right? All of the qualities that we develop, all the positive learning we've engaged in, and these other mental factors and our giving and all the things that we've engaged in this life, no one can take that away from you at all. You can destroy that positive potential yourself, but that's, hopefully something we will avoid. But no one can steal that. No one can in any way touch that. So this is the concept behind that. This is a treasury that we can build, through these seven factors. From the spiritual point of view, Geshe Wandarge says, we are progressing well if we have the awakening mind as our friend and these seven gems as our wealth. Rinpoche once requested his master, Milarepa. Most of you know of Milarepa, the wonderful Tibetan Buddhist saint who is said to have attained enlightenment in a single lifetime, even though he and his mother, through black magic, killed many people to get back at his uncle for stealing from their family and so on. But anyway, it says if he requested his master Milarepa for permission to go to Lhasa in central Tibet. After Rinpoche departed, Milarepa was saddened. When asked why, he said, my moon-like disciple has gone away, and I, like a dog, stay behind. When he was further asked what wealth and companions were sent along with his disciple, Milarepa replied, I sent him away with the wealth of the seven gems, and the friend of the awakening mind, Bodhicitta. I have no worries about his safety now. So it's kind of a cute little story that just points out to, again, we often think about, well, what am I taking with me in terms of money and other possessions that I will need on the trip? And all Milarepa was thinking about, of course, was he sent his disciple off with these seven inner riches and with Bodhicitta as his companion. So speaks to once more that these are the most important things to have, not to have bodyguards and a lot of money and wealth that we can rely upon and all these various ways. Yes, those factors do play some role in our comfort or safety, but the real safety, the real lack of danger comes from developing these qualities within. This is how we undermine all of the negative tendencies we've had and what's keeping us in our unenlightened state. So it's a cute little story about giving us, an appreciation for the value of this inner wealth, which we don't often think about. We tend to focus so much on the external stuff. Whoops, sorry, didn't mean to go two slides there. On to verse. So again, we just did 25 and 26 ABC. We're jumping back to the last two lines of verse 7. Again, in line with what James B. Apple does in his presentation of this text. He even kind of moves them around. I don't know if they were originally in that order. He doesn't explain it, but anyway, it seems like the more common order is to put them towards the end of the text. But I like moving them up there where we can talk about them in the context of the first two lines of verse 7. Going on to this one, avoid all trivial distractions and reside in the solitude of wilderness. It is important that we recognize how we get caught up in so many mundane affairs. Remember, this is in Buddhist terms, one of our forms of laziness, that we can get all kinds of mundane preoccupations, tending to all sorts of things. And even if we're not going away into solitude or anything, if we're just living our day and trying to do our Dharma practice, frequently these things get in the way of our Dharma practice, where we might finish a day and all we've done is engage in all kinds of mundane worldly stuff, and then we don't have the energy for our practice at all. We don't go to the teachings, or we do whatever, instead, and just kind of chill out. Well, that preoccupation with all these trivial worldly things is going to be the ruin of us. We should, to some degree, simplify our lives so that we don't have so many things that we are tending to. But nonetheless, I'm not saying that we have to be 100% dedicated to Dharma. That will be where hopefully we end up eventually. But even right now, to spend even 50% of our waking time on Dharma would be wonderful, or 25% perhaps. Again, we have to each work with our own individual situation. But in that latter part of the verse, it talked about kind of relying upon solitude. It is important that we recognize that part of our Buddhist path is to spend some time in retreat, in solitude, to actually divorce ourselves from mundane worldly activities, all of our devices now in our current lives, we just leave behind and we go inside and focus on working on our minds, particularly if we're going to develop any lasting qualities. Short retreats are nice, but if we're going to actually change our minds and develop deeper meditation, we have to spend some duration of time in solitude. Um, Again, bodhisattvas don't avoid others. That's not why they go into solitude. They are very happy to be involved with others, to be out in the world and tending to the needs of other beings. But they have to work on themselves too. This is the two-pronged thing of bodhicitta, right? We are intent upon helping other beings, dedicated to their welfare, but we have to become enlightened for their sake. And you do that in part through the activities that you're engaged in, tending to other beings, but that's not going to get you enlightened by itself. We need to also have our own cultivation of our deeper insight into things, cultivating those seven riches that we just talked about, those seven forms of wealth. So there's a few things I wanted to just refer to, just other texts that have similar kinds of concepts, beginning with, it's not going down now. I had this happen to me once before. Let me see if I go back to it, if it comes back. Otherwise, I may have to go out of it and come back in. Let's see. Where is that? Is it there? Let's try this one. Okay. Oops. Somehow I jumped ahead. Okay, there we go. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so here was the verse. So this is I've got two verses that I'm sharing from the very beginning of what are called the 37 Practices of Bodhisattvas by Tokme Sampo. I don't know. I know you guys have had teachings on that text, probably from Geshe Sherab, um, but it's worth maybe reconnecting with this text at some point in the future and studying it again. It's a very rich text, 37 verses of practice and then a few introductory and afterwards verses. But nonetheless, it says here, attached to your loved ones, you're stirred up like water. Hating your enemies, you burn like fire. In the darkness of confusion, you forget what to adopt and discard. Give up your homeland. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. So, what it's kind of saying is that in our normal everyday life, we get stirred by these three poisons of attachment, hatred, confusion. And so we have to kind of give up what is called here our homeland, meaning the normal way that we just sort of absorb ourselves into our daily life. We have to extract ourselves from that and recognize that there's great benefit to isolating ourselves from these objects that normally cause the three poisons to arise. Then it says in the very next verse, verse 3, by avoiding bad objects, disturbing emotions gradually decrease. Without distraction, virtuous activities naturally increase. With clarity of mind, conviction in the teaching arises. Cultivate seclusion or isolation, being separated in solitude from others. This is the practice of bodhisattvas. So I'm not going to do a huge commentary on that because again, that's another text. But the idea is that we see these similar themes play out. If we just go about continuing to live our lives and don't ever isolate ourselves from all the things that cause our delusions to normally arise, then we might not be so successful at calming our minds and developing these deeper qualities. If we isolate ourselves from all those things, which of course is what retreat is meant to be about. Not that you can completely get rid of anything that will annoy you or cause you attachment or have you develop deeper confusion or ignorance. We can still encounter those things in retreat. But if we have our minds somewhat more subdued in retreat by not being around all of the normal objects of our delusions, then we will actually be able to have much more clarity and virtue will more naturally arise. And because we'll be in retreat, we won't have all the normal preoccupations and distractions, what have you. So this is an important part of our path. Now, I do want to emphasize that to spend longer time in retreat, of course, we don't all have the karma for that, and we might not even have created the merit to make that successful. That is something Rinpoche would point out on occasion, was that to be successful at developing deep meditation doesn't just take having the time and a space where you can go and some of these other prerequisites that are mentioned in the Lam Rim text. We also have to have accumulated the positive potential, the merit to make that successful. That's why we engage in what are called the ngundro, the preliminary practices that help us to accumulate merit and kind of create the proper ground in our minds for the seeds of realization to grow. But this is not something that maybe all of us will get to do in this lifetime, but at least have that aspiration, thinking about how wonderful it would be if I could spend, a year in retreat, 2 years in retreat, 3 years in retreat. Many of these traditions in Tibetan Buddhism have a 3 year, 3 month retreat, which sounds like an incredibly long time, right? But this is what we want to ideally want to engage in, to be have that amount of time that we can really focus on deepening our practice. Even if we can do just a week retreat or a month retreat or something much, much shorter, that's perfectly fine, just as long as we don't lose that vision of trying to create the conditions for us to be able to engage in longer retreat. So I just wanted to throw that out there because some people don't think about, well, uh, is that a possibility or, what have you. It's good to think in those terms, to think that we can actually have some dedicated time for meditation. And it may be a very blissful experience. I like this little quote that Geshe Ngawang Dargye shared about some great meditator once said, "As a beginner, I find this life in the mountains enjoyable. Birds and animals come to visit me, and I can freely talk with them without it giving rise to anger, attachment, and a host of other delusions." Whereas the people that might come to talk to us in our everyday life, we might have different response to them. Hopefully, again, we can be in a much more natural environment, a place where the mind can settle, where we don't have those ordinary distractions. Verse 8: abandon frivolous words, constantly guard your speech. This one's, of course, about our speech and how we need to tame our speech to not be engaging in, it's called here frivolous words, but we're talking about essentially our meaningless words, the things that we very easily engage in with others, right? And that's, of course, one of our daily preoccupations, is just spending time talking to others about politics, and these days perhaps, or talking about other things that are more mundane. I'm not saying these things are completely irrelevant and we shouldn't spend any time on them, but we really have to look at to what degree are we engaging in that, making our speech really quite frivolous and not so meaningful. Um, Oftentimes the term idle gossip is used, but I don't like that term as quite as much, because we think gossip maybe means talking about celebrities or something like that. But here, by this frivolous speech or frivolous talk, we're simply talking about anything we do that's meaningless. We Little bit of it is fine in our lives, because we do have to connect with others and converse with others. We can't always be talking about the Dharma. But watch how we get very caught up in it. How suddenly we're, you know, just enjoying, relishing the conversation we're having about very meaningless things. So this is important. And then where it says constantly guard your speech, of course, this is something that is at the root of so much of our teachings that the Buddha gave on our morality. Speech is the main way that we connect with others, right? We do things physically. We are embodied, so we are with them physically. But in terms of our misbehavior, we tend not to kill so much, steal so much, or engage in a sexual behavior that's unwise. Again, those three of body. Whereas if we talk about the four of speech, we might lie a little bit here and there. We might try to divide others through the things we talk about in terms of Republicans and Democrats and da 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 and all this stuff that gives rise to us and them mentality. We certainly engage in harsh speech on occasion, where we say things that are not so gentle and kind. And then this idle talk, this meaningless talk that we were just referring to, all of these we engage in quite easily. And these are the main way that we connect with other beings. So we really have to guard our speech. I think I mentioned when we were going through that Eric Solvig Eric Kolvig, he was a teacher in the Vipassana tradition. He mentioned the two things. I don't know if anyone remembers. He said, we should ask ourselves, what am I saying and why am I saying it? So we look at not just the content of what our words are. What are these words? Are they beneficial? Are they kind? Are they useful? What have you? But we also say, well, why am I saying those things? What's my motivation? I think that will keep us in line with what the advice that Atisha is giving us here. Constantly guard your speech. I may have even mentioned in regard to speech that there's that this other quote that I think it's attributed to the Buddha and something I've seen on the internet, but who knows if the Buddha really said it. But there's this phrase of don't speak unless you can improve on silence. That's kind of a profound thought too. There's something really quite nice about silence. um, so essentially, we do have to be kind of mindful of what we are saying, and if it improves on the silence that's already there, that we can maybe rely upon um, as a healthy way of being with others, well, then maybe we can say something. But if it doesn't improve on silence, maybe we just stick with silence. I know in our culture we get very uncomfortable with silence. I remember even when one of the retreats that I led many, many years ago when we were still going up to the Mandala Center up in northeast New Mexico, east of Raton. Um, we would do the parts of the retreat in silence. And there was one woman who had a really, really hard time sitting at a table of people eating food in silence. And she said it was taking her back to when her father would be upset and at her mother or something, and there would be like this tension in the air where like neither of them was talking, and so the kids at the table were not talking and nobody was talking, and it was really, brought back these kind of strange feelings because that's often again the default is that we are talking to each other really free flowing with words constantly, and when there's silence people can interpret it in a variety of ways. Why aren't you saying anything? What's wrong? Are you mad at me? Are you upset at me? Whatever. So it is hard to adjust to silence sometimes, but sometimes silence is a preferable option to saying something. We really don't have anything that meaningful to add, the tendency will be to say things that are not so meaningful and certainly could be harsh or could be divisive ways of talking about others. So that's a lot of advice in those two lines. That is essentially how we need to tend to our speech. I'm not going to say too much more, but I will share a little quote here. This is from, again, Geshe Awandargi's commentary, and he said, the junior tutor to His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the late Trijang Rinpoche, said, if you find your mind in a state not conducive to performing virtuous activities, do not go and talk idly with someone. Why? Because that could become non-virtuous really quickly. Instead, go to sleep is his advice. You might not accumulate much virtue, but at least you will not accumulate non-virtue. I kind of like that one too, because oftentimes we don't take that other route of, well, maybe I just need to detach myself from everything and just lay down, go to bed. At least, I'm not going to engage in much non-virtue by rabbiting on about this and that and what have you. So again, I think these are pieces of advice that we can take and adapt to our own situation, but try to think very clearly about what we are saying and why we are saying it whenever we are talking to others. Then this is another quote from Patrul Rinpoche. Patrul Rinpoche was a great Nyingma Lama, Nyingma being the first of the four lineages in Tibet, four traditions, said, now that I am ready to go into retreat, I shall stop talking altogether. I shall cease sending my mind out to seek the faults in others, and instead I shall spend my time looking within. Life is too short to waste in mental wandering and limitless gossip. So once more, especially if we're going into retreat, we should practice silence in retreat. It's just very important that we kind of shut that off and don't have that active while we are going inside and working on our minds. Then the next two lines of verse 8, when you see your teachers and preceptors reverently generate the wish to serve. Of course, those beings who are in the role of being our teachers, our preceptors, who've given us vows and what have you, there's a level of honor and respect that we should have for them quite naturally. We've studied in the Lam Rim, all of you have studied the topic of relying upon and relating to a spiritual teacher. Remember that there are different levels of spiritual teachers, but anyone who has been our teacher of the Dharma to any degree, whether we consider them to be a guru or lama, those kind of higher teachers that we have, or whether they are just somebody who gave us Dharma instruction in a scholastic setting, like as a college professor, whoever it was that gave us something, we have some level of respect because of what we have gained from that experience. We have benefited from hearing teachings on what the Buddha taught from them in some capacity. But especially, we should be very careful to maintain a respectful attitude towards those who are our gurus or lamas. And especially if we have a tantric relationship with them, if we have taken tantric initiation, empowerment, or commentary instruction on from them, we should definitely hold them in the most superior light, ideally seeing them as Buddhas. And we can even apply that to some of our other teachers. And of course, in the Lam Rim, it's taught to try to see all of our teachers as Buddhas. But I don't, again, it's not required until we get to the tantric level. But it's something to kind of play with, to entertain the idea. And once more, the logic for seeing our gurus as Buddhas is that if Buddhas are still active in the world, which we would imagine they are, beings who were like us, who aspired to become a Buddha and then have attained that state, well, their whole mission and purpose is to enlighten beings. So they would be active in the world doing that. And of course, who is doing the work of the Buddhas? Who is it that is actually disseminating the Dharma, giving tantric empowerments and so on? It's our gurus. So ideally, we see that they are doing the Buddha's work and are the, if not just the emissaries or ambassadors of the Buddhas, they perhaps are actually Buddhas themselves. Now, how else would Buddhas be benefiting us if not in the form of our gurus? So I'm not going to go into great detail on that teaching, but know that that's the very first topic that's discussed in terms of meditation topics in the Lam Rim, in the way that Lama Tsongkhapa approached. He felt it was really important to see that everything starts with seeing our gurus as Buddhas, or at least having some level of respect and admiration for them, wishing to serve them. That was mentioned in our verse. Service can be of a variety of ways. We can certainly do actual things to help them, take them, like when Geshe Sherab, if Geshe Sherab is someone you consider to be one of your teachers, taking him back and forth to Santa Fe and up to Taos, treating him to a meal or to a hike or whatever it is that he would find enjoyable. I mean, all these things are useful. But also we can do Dharma service for our teachers, where we translate their teachings or transcribe their teachings if their teachings were in English, or all these other things. So essentially, that's one way. We certainly can be generous materially with our teachers. Most teachers, once more, have projects that they support, these higher lamas and what have you. Lama Zopa Rinpoche had many, many projects that he supported. We can also, of course, offer our Dharma practice to our gurus, and that is said to be the best offering. So the way we serve the gurus ideally is to practice what they preach, to practice what they have given us. So reverently generate that wish to serve whenever we see our teachers, holding them in that respectful vein. On to verse 9, toward wise beings with Dharma eyes, meaning those who have these deeper realizations, and even toward beginners on the path as well. Recognize them also as your spiritual teachers. Doesn't say also in there, but I think the idea is that we do have those that we do identify very clearly as our own teachers, that we have engaged in that relationship with, of setting them as our teacher, spiritual mentor, and us as their disciple. But we also have other beings with great wisdom that we can look to and learn from, and perhaps not necessarily develop that guru disciple relationship, but we understand that due to the qualities that they possess, they are very useful for us to learn from. But we can learn from anybody, essentially, even all the way down to beginners. And oftentimes it's really helpful for us to go back to very basic beginner teachings. Maybe sit in on a beginning Buddhism class and just pretend to be back at the very beginning and hear what other people say. Sometimes when beginners look at the Dharma, they're seeing it with such fresh eyes and such interesting insight that it can be very insightful for us who've been around the Dharma for a while and perhaps have gotten a little not disenchanted with it by any means, but it just doesn't have the luster that it had when we first approached it, right? When we first found the Dharma and we're finding all of this resonance and truth and beauty in it and what have you. And then perhaps, that has diminished to some degree over time. Beginners can be great teachers for us. We even here in the Zen tradition, Suzuki Roshi, I think, emphasized this idea of having beginner's mind. We kind of try to keep our mind from thinking too much about all the knowledge that we've accumulated and acting from that vantage point, but always be willing to learn, always have that beginner's mentality. And if we look at anybody we meet as potentially offering us a lesson, well, then we do look at them very differently. We don't think about me and myself and who I am. We look at them and think, well, here's a being, here's a suffering being in samsara. What can I learn from this being? And what is it that they have to teach me? And even our worst enemies can be our best teachers. We know this from the Lojong teachings, the mind transformation teachings, where those beings who have been particularly difficult for us have incredible lessons to share with us if we're willing to be in that space with them, if we're actually willing to look at our own minds and our own judgment and our own stuff that comes up in response to what they are doing. But these are, again, said to be often our greatest teachers, those beings who have harmed us. So everyone we meet, everyone we encounter can essentially be a teacher for us. Uh, they might not be in the same category as a guru. I'm not saying that, as the ones that we actually have that direct relationship to. But nonetheless, they can teach us great lessons on the spiritual path. All right. In fact, when you see any sentient being, view them as your parent, your child, or your grandchild. The idea being here that we want to think of them as someone very dear to us. How often, when we just see a stranger on the street, do we just walk by without any regard for them or any thoughts about them? But if we think about them as like, oh, this is a being that I need to tend to, I need to take care of to some degree, whether or not we stop and do something for them isn't maybe as important as what is our attitude towards them. Do we have that sense of endearment towards them? And this should be anyone that we meet, essentially, even those that fall into that category of being difficult, enemies, what have you. Can we hold that view of someone who is like a dear child? We go, oh, there's one of those suffering sentient beings that I want to become enlightened for, even just to hold that thought. You don't necessarily have to do more for them in the moment. If the situation arises and you can do more for them, then by all means, let that be an extension, those actions of that thought, holding them to be someone very dear to you. But that's the idea behind this, is not to let ourselves fall into maybe a more habitual way of looking at others from that lens of friends, enemies, strangers, and developing these attitudes that are distorted with relation to those, but rather as every being, as being someone very dear to us, see them all equally with that mind. So some of these verses, again, I'm not going to talk about quite as much. Uh, Go on to 10ab. This is an interesting one. Again, another fortune cookie for us if we use Atisha's text in that way. Renounce negative friendships and rely on a spiritual friend. So we've been talking here in these last few verses a lot about spiritual friends or people that we can learn from, people we need to develop a good relationship with. You might look at this, and all the advice I've been giving you is around seeing difficult people or enemies in a positive light. So what's this about renouncing negative friendships and relying on a spiritual friend? Well, this is what, when it comes down to certainly our deeper practice of things, when we want to actually learn the Dharma from others as opposed to learning how to behave, then we want to rely upon those beings who actually are upholding and supporting the Dharma. And this, again, means that we're not going to shut those negative beings out of our heart. That's not what we're talking about at all. Rather, we're not going to look to them to be our guides, look to them to give us the instruction about how to behave in the world, because they're not doing it in their own behavior. These negative friends that are mentioned here are those that are going about living their lives antithetical to the Dharma, and perhaps even having some animosity towards the Dharma. Certainly, those are not the beings we want to rely upon as our true spiritual friends, because they are going against the grain of everything we're trying to practice. So this is pointing out the fact that we will benefit much greater if we actually surround ourselves with like-minded individuals who support us in our practice. That's why we have centers like City Garba Center in order to produce a community of people, which we often refer loosely to as a Sangha, but a community of practitioners who we can rely upon, who we can get together with and discuss Dharma, and we can be with them and not be totally disturbed with our own emotions and what have you. If we were relying upon these negative friendships, people that we know that are engaging in behavior that is antithetical to the Dharma, as our spiritual guides, we would not probably have the support that we needed. Now, there may be very high level practitioners who can hang around with those beings and not be affected. I'm not saying that that's outside the realm of possibility. But for most of us, especially if we are beginners or even, up through the middle of our path where we can be influenced greatly by others, we need to be very careful around beings who could take us astray. I know sometimes it sounds like the Buddha's sort of being like our parent. Well, don't go hanging out with them. You shouldn't be hanging out with those kids. They're not very good for you or something. But here we're talking about really our spiritual progress and of course the benefit to others that's going to follow if we actually do get upheld in our practice by those beings that we choose to surround ourselves with. There's a wonderful little quote. Well, I don't know how wonderful it is, but a quote from a text that Lama Zopa Rinpoche translated. It's a very short text called Heart Advice of Acho Rinpoche. And he says there is no difference between male and female as evil friends of negative karma who make you lose this and all future lives. Therefore, throw them far away like a stone used for cleaning your bottom. When I first read this, I was like, a stone used for cleaning your bottom? Maybe this was what they did in Tibet, is that they actually used stones to clean their bottom because there was no toilet paper and not very many trees because they're above the tree line in many parts of Tibet. So maybe this is how they actually cleaned themselves, is took a stone and then maybe threw the stone in the water or who knows what. I have no idea. But the concept here is really kind of harsh. It might sound really, uh, oh my gosh, I'm going to treat these people like I would use toilet paper, essentially just throwing them away. But we're not talking about once more that doing that internally in regard to our own minds. We still see them as objects of compassion. We still see them as beings that we want to become enlightened to benefit. We just recognize that in the context of this verse, we don't want to rely upon them as our guides. They are not good people to hang around with. And this advice is given frequently in the Buddha's teachings, where we do have to be somewhat mindful around who we choose to spend our time with, because people will tend to follow those individuals and often get into misbehavior. It's just what happens as beings that are conditioned towards the delusions, as we are, as we certainly have been in many, many lifetimes. So we have to be careful in choosing our friends and our acquaintances. One thing I might mention here, which is at least my own experience, is that I certainly had a lot of people that I knew before I met the Dharma who certainly like to drink and like to do drugs and like to do many things. And, it's not like I made a conscious choice of like slamming the door on those people and just said, okay, get out of my life. I don't want you here anymore. You're like to use toilet paper. I don't think that's how we want to go about doing this even. What I found myself is that as I started making a more conscious choice about how I wanted to spend my own time, the things I wanted to engage in, and so on, that I was having less interaction with them, of course, because I was choosing to do other things, but they sort of fell by the wayside in a sense. I think I only have like one or two friends that are in that category of people that I knew from that time in my life that I still associate with or have any contact with. And of course, my mind's more capable now of being with them and not getting too caught up in all of their stuff and what have you. But I think this is something that if we make a conscious choice around who we want to be with, the spiritual friends that we want to have in our lives, then the other folks will tend to fall by the wayside. Anyway, that's just what I have seen. I don't know if it's true for everybody. Let's go back to our text and carry on after the last little bit of this text by Acho Rinpoche says, the virtuous friend and virtuous companion is the originator of qualities. Therefore, correctly devote and dedicate yourself, which was, similar to what was said in that previous one, and rely on a spiritual friend. So renounce the negative friendships, Again, those beings that you can kind of set aside as if they were toilet paper or what have you, and rely on a spiritual friend instead. Rely on those beings who will actually be the source of good qualities for us. Verse 10 CD, the last two lines of that verse say, dispel hostility and unpleasantness. These are obviously qualities that we don't want to have towards others, any hostility, maliciousness, evil intent. And then, of course, any unpleasantness with others. Ideally, we should be about trying to create a very amenable environment for others through how we are, our ability to smile at others, to be very kind to them, to be gentle with them, and venture forth to where happiness lies. It's kind of interesting. This last part, I found the Alex's translation to be a little bit different and maybe a better translation for what it's worth. I don't know for sure which is the better translation literally, but it says here, let me rid myself of hostility and uneasy mental states and go happily everywhere. So the idea isn't you aren't going to some place where happiness lies. You're actually going happily everywhere. Because once you develop these positive qualities and abandon your hostility and so on towards others, then wherever you go, you don't have to worry about who it is that you meet because you're going to have an easygoing, pleasant way of being in the world. You know, there's that wonderful phrase that Lama Zopa Rinpoche would say frequently, no enemy inside, no enemy outside. We can go anywhere we want if we aren't, from our side, seeing everyone as an enemy, if we aren't choosing that label to put on beings that we disagree with or that have harmed us or what have you. The enemy is created by our own minds. Yes, there's the actions of the beings that they have done, which we don't deny, but I'm the one that's choosing to see them as an enemy in the face of those actions. Once more, as I was just saying a short while ago, we could actually see them as a teacher, as someone that we can learn from. Because those beings who are harming us or harming those that we love, they're actually an incredible test for our patience, our compassion, our kindness. Is it possible for us to go beyond our labeling them as an enemy and see them through the lens of those positive attitudes? Well, what's being said in this verse is that if you have those kinds of positive attitudes that you're going about living your life, well, then you'll be happy anywhere because the outside situation won't matter. You won't bring any of that unpleasantness or any ill will towards anyone wherever you go. Instead, you'll have a mind that's extremely easygoing, that is not going to make those judgments on others and have those distorted attitudes. So that's the concept behind this one. I think it's a really nice verse, again, that we uh, can it sort of gives us the measure of where our happiness comes from. So there's meaning to both of the translations. Thupten Jinpa's venture forth to where happiness lies. Well, happiness lies anywhere if we have dispelled these negative states of mind, if there's no enemy inside. And then, of course, Alex's verse is very similar in regard to that. Um, This is a little quote from Gen Geshe Ngawang Dargye in his commentary. He says, if we are angry and aggressive, happiness will always elude us. Happiness and contentment are dependent entirely on our attitudes towards daily situations and life in general. Full of anger, we cannot even enjoy the good fortune of wealth or delicious food. Yet, with peace of mind, we shall be content with the most basic diet and simple dwellings. So the external situation doesn't matter as much as the internal one. If we have changed our minds, if we are looking at things in a much different way, then whatever is going on the outside will be seen in a positive light. A true practitioner of Dharma, he goes on to say, should be like a bee that is never attracted to just one flower, but flies from one to another. Unlike most people who are fastidious and critical, a spiritual person should have no preferences. We should be able to adapt to whatever circumstances we find, right? Happily go from one place to another without any real change in our minds. Our minds continue to have that constancy, that ability to kind of be with any situation from the same point of view. By remaining in one place too long, he then says, we make friends as well as enemies and become attached to the familiarity of our environment. Lama Tsongkhapa was called the Wanderer because as soon as people heard he was in one place and came to him presenting offerings, he would move on. I guess this was a very common practice for many of these lamas in Tibet, is that to kind of be in a place where they didn't have to be constantly seen in the light of their disciples, looking to them as um, with an elevated sense of who they were and what have you. They would do these sort of wandering retreats where they would go and they would just wear ordinary clothes and they would be left in by certain people, whatever. And then once somebody identified who they were and started to think of them in a more positive light, where they were like, oh, Lama, and wanting blessings and whatever and all this. It's not that they don't want to help those beings. It's just they're trying to work on their own mind and stop their own conceit, feelings of pride or arrogance they might have in relation to their standing in that role. So they would just kind of move on, and that way you don't get involved in having friends, having difficult relationships with anybody. You just kind of keep yourself moving. What's the phrase? A rolling stone gathers no moss. That's a similar concept, I think, to what's being talked about here. But this is the way to develop some deeper happiness in the world. Whoops. And he says he acted in this way until he achieved full realization. Then he remained in one place and, speaking from his own experience, gave discourses, founded monasteries, and performed other beneficial activities. So there was a time in his life where, no longer needing that kind of wandering mentality, he was able to just settle down and then create amazing benefits once he had attained all the realizations that he was seeking. So, again, some interesting advice about how we can go about attaining qualities that we can then benefit others with. Verse 11, this is some advice, that Atisha is giving us for leading a happy life. He says, abandon attachment to all things and abide free of desire. Desire and attachment are usually used interchangeably. Once more, that's the distortion that we have in relation to pleasurable objects, where we see those things as a necessary part of creating our happiness and we inflate their qualities and we don't want to be separated from those objects of desire. Desire is a trap. It's something that we get caught up in very easily. As it says there in the latter part of this verse, attachment fails to bring even the higher realms. In fact, it kills the life of true liberation. When the Buddha taught the Four Noble Truths in his very first discourse, when he was speaking about the truth of dukkha or suffering, the situation we're in, and then going on to say, and the cause of it, the origin of it is, he went on to say in that very first sutra that the origin is craving, is desire. And that's the most direct cause of our suffering. Of course, there's a deeper root, which is our ignorance, and that's something we talk about frequently in this tradition. But the most active way that we get into our suffering patterns is through the mind of desire, which we're surrounded by all of these pleasant objects, objects of the senses and so on that draw us in and that we get totally addicted to. Remember Venerable Rabina, she says we're like junkies born into a world of junk. This is what it's like being a human being and being in the desire realm, is that we see all these pleasurable things and we're just drawn to them immediately, thinking, oh, I want that. That's going to make me happy. Oh, and that's going to make me even happier. No, I want more of that because I want more of that happiness. And we don't want to be separated from any of these things. And if we live our lives solely engaged in attachment to this, attachment to that, and so on, when it comes to our death, we're not going to be able to let go of this life very easily at all because all of those things are still in our mind, even if we can't enjoy them physically. We still have this mind of craving and desire that is just not wanting to be parted from all of that at all. So again, it can ruin our spiritual life. Our whole life can be consumed with obtaining objects of desire, or at least the experiences of those objects, whether we not, might acquire some physical things. But think about somebody who is obsessed with food. I mean, we had that one guy. What was his name? He did a TV thing or something on food, and he passed away a few years ago. Where he'd go to all these exotic countries. I can't remember his name anyway. We have many people that can get totally preoccupied with gaining some experiences of samsara in terms of travel or food or whatever, and they live their whole life doing that. And then what? They die, and all those memories, and certainly all the non virtue they created through developing deeper and deeper attachment to all of those experiences, it's just going to be problematic. They're not going to die with a peaceful, happy mind. At least my assessment on from the outside looking in. I'm not, I don't know the minds of any of these beings. Maybe they were great practitioners and able to be wherever they were at and have a contentment, and regardless of what food was being served them or how comfortable their accommodations were, or whatever the case might be. But most beings, if they're again falling in the pattern of what we normally see in human behavior, are totally obsessed with getting objects of attachment. And then, of course, objects of attachment lead themselves, if you don't get those, to the other side of it, which is the anger, the aversion, when we get the opposite, when we don't get what brings us pleasure. When you go to the restaurant that's supposed to be serving this phenomenal meal that you just can't wait to try, and you get a kind of mediocre meal that you're not impressed with at all. Well, that's what happens when attachment doesn't get what it wants. So, attachment is a really powerful force in our lives. Now, again, when we use the term desire to be an equivalent for it, we're not talking about healthy desires. The desire to become a Buddha for the sake of all beings, that's a healthy desire or aspiration. We're talking about here once more this obsession we have with worldly things, contaminated experiences, and not wanting to be parted from those things, having inflated their sense of the pleasantness that we get from them, and so on. So, once more, as it said there, even in that verse, that attachment also fails to bring even the higher realms. You don't even get good rebirths through following the mind of attachment. You have to begin to let go of some of that, even just to get a good rebirth in your next life. You have to be, stop being attached to what is driving so many of our non-virtuous actions, which is usually coming out of some level of desire. It can also be arising out of anger, but as I said, anger is just what happens when desire or attachment doesn't get what it wants. The real driving force, it seems, from a lot of what the Buddha taught, is our mind of craving and grasping desire that is perpetual almost. From the moment we get up, start thinking about what we need for our comfort, for to bring us some pleasure, some happiness each day until we go to bed. It's constantly under the control of our desire. So I do have, I think, one or two quotes to share that elucidate that. I hope you don't mind these additional quotes. They're just kind of nice to bring in here. This is from the oral commentary that Alex Berzin gave, not, and he, of course, was a student of Geshe Ngawang Dargye as well. He said, Geshe Ngawang Dargye used to say, life is too short to taste everything. So don't become a professional tourist of samsara. You don't have to taste everything of samsara. That's not going to get you anywhere. And Alex says he thought that was a very helpful piece of advice. You know, oftentimes our lamas say we've done everything pleasant that there is to be done in samsara, and what has it done for us, right? We've never gained anything from all those experiences. We had that passing, fleeting experience of some measure of happiness or pleasure, and then it's gone, like a dream. Then there is a text that Lama Zopa Rinpoche, this is translated in some of the teachings he gave at Light of the Path, the Kadampa Geshe Shawagon. The cause of all outer suffering is desire for this life. Therefore, you must renounce the desire of this life. When the desire for achievement in this life is too strong, then your mind is not happy. Right? I mean, we get continually driven by desire, by attachment, continually, especially obsessed with this life. Desire for the pleasant experiences of the future life. I could say that maybe that's a bit of the driving force for seeking a future existence, so that we have good conditions in our next life. But we have to then let go of at least being attached to the pleasant things of this life. If we're totally preoccupied, which again, most beings are, most human beings, certainly animals have no choice. Animals just are continually driven by trying to get what they want and desire, and have no way of curbing their minds. But most human beings who do have the potential to lessen their desire are still driven by it almost 24 hours a day. And just continually looking for that next hit, that next wonderful thing around the corner. Let me do a little bit more before I do questions. In continuing with that quote from this Kadampa Geshe Rinpoche translated that as this, when that happens, then all these three happen at once. We engage in negative karma because we're driven by desire. and we will invariably create negative karma even through just that mind of attachment, much less the actions we engage in. And then there will be suffering that results from that, the karmic effect, and then a bad reputation. People will be looking at us, and even though we're meant to be and trying to be spiritual practitioners, we're just living our lives filled with desire, chasing after all these worldly pleasures. Therefore, stop the many various thoughts of desire. So again, I don't know where the original text of that is. Rinpoche would always have these various quotes that he would refer to, and that was how it was translated in the transcripts. But and then one more little bit on that. He says, seeking so many things for the happiness of this life must stop. When you are able to turn away from the desire for this life's happiness, that is the beginning of happiness, meaning of actual happiness, or what we often refer to as the happiness of Dharma. Remember that we are not technically practicing Dharma if we are still attached to this life. That is where our very beginning practice of Dharma starts, is when we let go of our attachment to the pleasures of this life and seek existence beyond this that is favorable, at least that, and then liberation, and then eventually full enlightenment, Buddhahood. And we have to have something that goes beyond just the transitory pleasures that we're so attached to. Otherwise, again, it's pretty much a waste of this life. Okay, verse 12, first two lines. When you encounter the causes of happiness, in these always persevere. Of course, what are the causes of happiness? Causes of happiness are virtue, are engaging in positive actions that are beneficial to yourself and others. There's a little quote from Asanga, also translated by Lama Zopa. The happiness of enjoying Dharma covers the entire body. It happens whenever you want. It exists in all the three realms, meaning the realm of the desire realm that we're in, the form realm and the formless realm, these realms that are developed through deeper concentration. He goes on to say then, Asanga, once you achieve it, you have it wherever you are born. It causes you to achieve those seven riches of the Aryas that we talked about earlier tonight. So the happiness of Dharma is something we can have with us all the time. It was mentioned earlier that we'll never lose that. It's not something that someone else can steal from us. The treasury of our practice of the Dharma and the qualities we gain is something we will always have. And then it goes on to say in this advice from Asanga, by enjoying the happiness of Dharma, it never finishes. It only increases more and more. Enemies cannot destroy it. You can carry it to your next lives. You can complete the happiness of Dharma and achieve satisfaction. So when it says in the first line, it never finishes, and then in the last line, it says you complete it. By it never finishes, meaning it never disappears, it never goes away. And so the idea is that as we practice Dharma, it accumulates. As it says here, it increases more and more. No one can destroy it. We can carry it forward, life to life, and then eventually complete it and achieve full satisfaction. And that's where I thought I would end tonight, actually, when I was planning tonight's class. So it's 7:20. Let's see what questions or comments people have, because I've talked for quite a while now. So anything anyone wanted to share from any of the verses I talked about? Anne Marie, you look like you're working on unmuting, are you? Or because you're still muted right now. Did you want to unmute and add anything? If so, well, I still can't hear you. Sorry. Um, have to hit that one in the lower left-hand corner, the audio one that looks like a little microphone. I don't know if we can unmute you from here. Ah, there you are. You're unmuted. But I gotta get my volume up to hear you. I'm not hearing you for some reason. Ah, maybe there. Go ahead. Isn't isn't what the maybe could you just go a little closer to the computer? I'm not picking up everything. Is attachment closer to what? Close to what? Uh, Sorry, I'm not picking it up. For some reason, I don't know what's going on with the sound there, but other people I think are having a problem with it too. Mm. Oh, where'd she go? Anne Marie disappeared. Maybe she went off and is coming back in to hopefully. Did anyone pick up what she said? No. Just found it really, really hard. I was getting that she was saying attachment is similar to something, but I'm not sure. Let's see if there are other questions until hopefully she reappears. Maybe she hit the wrong button and somehow signed out. Anyone, any comments on tonight? Anything that well, let's see. If she doesn't reappear, I certainly can do another verse or two, but no, she's not coming back. So let me go ahead and do one more verse, and why not? And then if she does reappear, then we can. So again, I will reshuffle the slide so that what I put out on the Google Drive will cover what we did. This is the last part of verse 12. Verse 12 is like 6 lines, so these are the last 4 lines. Whichever task you take up first, address this task primarily. In this way, you ensure the success of both tasks, both the one that you're taking up now and the one that you're maybe setting aside to take up later. You know, where otherwise you accomplish neither. I mean, there are times where these bits of advice almost sound like, Miss Manners or something, or some just good advice from parenting or what have you. But there's something to be said for this. If we actually do accomplish what we set out to do, there's a feeling of having done that, of having achieved something, and then we have greater confidence going on to the next thing. We have that tendency in our culture of doing what we often call multitasking, right? Where we've got something going over here, and then we get something going over there, and a third thing, and a fourth thing, and we have all these things going on, and we might not ever bring all of them to completion at all. Certainly, this is one factor that leads to us gaining good results on the path, is if we say, okay, especially if we get into that vein of wanting to achieve realizations on the path. If we really want to focus on how do we develop a deeper understanding of all the topics of the Lam Rin, we'll start with the first topics and really work on them. After we've gone, certainly going through all of them in a retreat a few times is good, just so we know the whole layout of the Lam Rim. But when you're going to actually make a concerted effort to achieve realizations, then you start working with the very first topic and you work on that until you gain some taste of that topic, some sense of a realization, whether it's technically a fully qualified realization or not. That's maybe not to be kind of that doesn't matter as much. What we want to do, though, is to get to a place where we really kind of get what that topic is driving us to realize. And then we go on to the next one and we complete that. And we go on to the next one and we complete that. That's the way that we make progress rather than kind of bopping all over the place. And we do this topic and then the next day we do another one and then we go back to something else and then all over the place. And we don't ever make a concerted effort to achieve any individual realization. So that's what's being referred to here, and certainly giving us some advice about how we can make sure that we achieve some success on our spiritual path. This is from Master Shantideva's text. When something has been planned and started on, attention should not drift to other things. With thoughts fixed on the chosen target, that and that alone should be pursued. Once we determine this is what I need to work on, and maybe Rinpoche or some teacher gives us a particular practice that we need to do, then we go, okay, then that is what I need to focus on and get that done and achieve that, and not be always kind of torn between, 10 different things going on. Behaving in this way, Shantideva says, all tasks are well performed. In our text it said both tasks, but any tasks are well performed if we have that idea. And nothing is achieved by doing otherwise. We may not get anything done if we're just all over the place. If thus we act, the secondary defilement, lack of introspection, will not grow. This is one of what we call our secondary afflictions, non-introspection. Again, non-introspection is where we're just simply not tending to what we should be doing and getting constantly distracted or involved in other things. So again, that's how we actually avoid that. Maybe I'll save that advice till the next time, because I think that's a nice piece of advice and I don't know, gives us something to look forward to. Um, so any final questions from tonight? Anything anyone wanted to share? All right, then let's go ahead and do our dedications, and we'll start with our dedication list. And as I said, we did have some names that were being added. These are both for death. Ashley Cassius, and Anastasia Stacy Romo. If I've mispronounced those names, I apologize. But those names, again, will make sure that when we're back in the Gompa, that we put them on the list. Might need to remind us of those names, but essentially, yeah. And then it also, from Mary Jo, please add Aileen and family. Uh, and her, Aileen, I guess, is actively dying and dedicating also for her family who's dealing with her passing and what have you. So again, yeah, sorry for these losses in all of your lives. Let's go ahead and open it up. If anybody wanted to add any other individuals that they want to dedicate for at this time.
Gene Hackman and his wife in Santa Fe.
Yes, yeah, the sad news there, as well as the dog. There was a dog,
The
one of their
dog,
dogs that passed away
German
as well.
Shepherd.
Yeah. So those beings we dedicate for. Anyone else for death, illness, obstacles? Okay, so then those beings who are on the list that we don't have in front of us, that's at the center, we can include them just by thinking about them in an indirect way, all of their needs being met through what we have done, helping them to be free of obstacles, to be free of their illness, or certainly if they are beings who have died, to have ideal conditions, to attain a good rebirth, to meet with the precious Mahayana Dharma, and to become enlightened as quickly as possible. Then we'll go ahead and do the dedication prayers that we normally do at the end of class. Let me get that up on the
Don,
screen. Oh,
Don,
wow.
I just remembered my son called me that his very dear friend who was a Buddhist, his name is
Mm,
Jefferson. He
mm,
passed away on Monday, this last Monday.
mm. Oh, I'm sorry
Jefferson.
to hear that. Okay,
And
so Jefferson.
yeah, he actually gave me some Buddha statues that he couldn't use anymore. So, but I know
Mhm,
that he was a big friend of my son. So he
mm,
died of heart attack.
okay. So we dedicate also then for Jefferson. Okay, so then any other beings that we are holding in our hearts, we dedicate for their welfare as well. Let's go ahead and recite the dedication prayers together. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may we quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel Bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish but increase more and more. Then we'll recite the prayer for His Holiness's good health, long life, for all of his wishes to be fulfilled. And as we recite that, we can think about all of our other gurus who are still with us, that they may also have very long life with perfect health, and also that their wishes may be fulfilled immediately. The wish granting, wish fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Then we'll recite together the swift return prayer for Rinpoche so that we can create the causes for him to be back in an embodied form that we can all benefit from and will be of great benefit to all the beings in this world. Peerless teacher and assembly of the children of the victorious ones, Shravakas and Pratyeka Buddhas, victorious Losang, father and sons, along with the lineage masters, all the objects of refuge of infinite lands, please bestow the virtue and goodness of accomplishing this prayer here and now. Holding and spreading the Muni's precious and complete teachings through explanation and practice, you wear the armor of patience that is never discouraged. Incomparable venerable Guru, to you I make request. While striving single-pointedly for the sake of the victorious one's teachings, the sole gateway through which all benefit and happiness emerge, and for mother living beings, you suddenly departed to peace. What a great loss! Nevertheless, through the undeceiving truth of the blessings of the ocean of the three jewels, and the great waves of bodhicitta of the children of the victorious ones, may the smile of a reincarnation swiftly beam in glory for fortunate disciples. Okay, thank you all for joining tonight online. Again, sorry I can't be up there in person with all of you, but I do appreciate the ability to teach online tonight. And as I said, next Thursday I will teach from Santa Cruz, and then I will be in retreat the following week, and then back in Taos on the 20th. So 4 weeks, no, 5 weeks, 3 weeks from tonight, 3 weeks from tonight. So, all right, everyone, take care, be well. And again, try to work with these teachings as best as you can. Maybe review the verses over the next week, maybe one or two of them, and see what you can do in terms of changing your behavior according to the advice that Atisha is giving us. So,
Have
all
a
right, everyone.
safe trip, Don.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah.
Wonderful retreat.
Okay.
Thank,
Thanks. Yeah.
thank
Should
you,
enjoy
Don,
it.
and happy Losar.
Yes, yes.
Happy
Oh, yeah. I should say
Losar.
that.
Happy
Happy
Los.
Losar. It's technically Losar already in India, but
Yeah.
Tibetan New Year starts tomorrow, February 28th, and it goes for 2 weeks. So keep in mind that it's really good to do virtuous activities. Maybe come in for some of what TNL's offering or other centers. And if you guys can offer something, that would be nice. 2 weeks from tomorrow is the culmination of that, the first full moon of the new year, what's frequently called Day of Miracles, though all 2 weeks are essentially days of miracles, but it's the most powerful day in this first 2 weeks of the Tibetan calendar. So especially that Friday, good to do virtuous practices. So thank you for reminding me of that. Appreciate it, John. I get too caught up in all the stuff I'm doing right now, getting ready to get out of here, and I'll be involved in all kinds of activities out there at Land of Medicine Buddha, particularly around New Year's and what have you. But all right, everyone, be well, practice well.
Good night. Thank you,
Okay.
Donald.
Okay, you're
Good night.
very welcome. Thanks so much, everyone.